fans, what's going on? It's Landon Remixes here, and it's time for a pretty big one. Today I'll be talking about the sophomore album from Barely Alive, Odyssey. Barely Alive is a bass music duo comprised of producers Willie Watkins and Matt Meyer, formerly known as Will the Beats and Hook Jr. The duo first caught my attention in late 2013 with their remix of Hellberg's Collide. I can actually very clearly recall the first time I had ever feasted my ears on this remix. I was in my kitchen and just absolutely moshing. I just remember being so blown away by how Barely Alive and Astronaut managed to make that Collide melody just rip right through me. Also, the growl fills in that remix are among some of the best I've ever heard. Needless to say, I was instantly converted into a fan, and I would go on to support Barely Alive's releases for many years to come. Their first two Disciple EP releases, Lost in the Internet and Internet Streets, more than anything. That is, except for one project, the duo's surprising debut album, We Are Barely Alive. I loved the heck out of that album, and I still love it quite a bit. In fact, every time I want to give people an example of a bass music album that does a really great job of tying together a varied collection of bangers, I point them to this album. While I felt like a couple of Barely Alive's previous EPs didn't quite meet the bar that they had set for themselves, We Are Barely Alive definitely hit that and even went beyond it. Though from that point forward, at least for a while, I honestly saw Barely Alive as going kind of downhill. Many of you already know I felt very indifferent to Barely Alive's Domain EP on Auslaw, and some of their single releases like Basement Dwellers left me feeling completely underwhelmed. When RIDDIM began to take over, I kind of felt that Barely Alive had lost a lot of that character and personality that made them a standout name to begin with. When I found out that Barely Alive was releasing another album, I was pretty caught off guard to say the least. I was both very excited and very worried about it. Excited because it was following up one of my favorite bass music albums ever, but worried because it was following up one of my favorite bass music albums ever in a period that I didn't feel like Barely Alive was releasing their strongest music. The album's preview didn't really ease my worries either. It honestly made Odyssey sound a little bit messy, but of course, no matter what, this wasn't going to be an album that I was going to skip out on. So, Odyssey. What did I think? First of all, and I think most importantly, this album is a lot better than I anticipated it to be. Odyssey is just about, if not even more diverse than We Are Barely Alive. There are also numerous moments on this album that I feel like really blew Barely Alive's recent work out of the water. I'll get to which tracks I really enjoyed in a bit, but I will say this album isn't without some major flaws. Odyssey is, for all intents and purposes, a concept album. I have no problem with EDM acts doing concept albums. In fact, some of my favorite albums of all time have been conceptual dance records. But if it's gonna be done, it's gotta be done right, and I feel like Barely Alive was just trying to do too much with this album. Rather than focusing on one central theme and developing that throughout the album, Barely Alive is kind of doing two different things on Odyssey. The first is the central theme of science fiction across the album. The name of the album seems to be a reference to 2001: A Space Odyssey. The album's artwork is going for a little bit more of a Back to the Future kind of deal. There's a track called Xenomorph, which is clearly a reference to Alien. There's the War of the Worlds interlude, which actually features a sample of the War of the Worlds radio drama that caused mass panic in the US. Odyssey's second theme, as the title track suggests, is that it's a journey through sound, though I don't really think it's possible for any album to be more of a journey through music than the Avalanche's Wildflower. I think this was actually a pretty good theme for Barely Alive to go for on this album. I mean, they did it in a little bit more of a subtle way on We Are Barely Alive, but I have no problem with them drawing it out a little bit clearer on an album. Barely Alive has never really had an issue showing off their influences from the 80s, from the 90s, and even from the 2000s in their discography. And while Barely Alive did pool a lot of those influences together on Odyssey, I feel that it was done in a really sloppy way. During my first run-through of Odyssey, I remembered being really intrigued by the outro of Know About Me, where the voice says, "You have reached your destination, 1983. So when I first heard this, the gears in my head kind of started turning, and I thought, oh, this album's about a spaceship called the Odyssey, which takes listeners on a journey through sound. The problem here is, if this was supposed to be the album's concept, Barely Alive completely abandons it after Deeper in Love. With exception to a couple really smooth transitions, there really seems to be no rhyme or reason to this track list. Again, going back to my first time listening through this album, I remembered feeling really confused and disoriented when Deeper in Love went straight into Bad Thing. Two totally different eras and styles of music being represented on these two tracks, and the album doesn't really care to guide you through why that drastic shift happens. A number of these drastic gear shifts happen throughout the album with really no explanation for it, and the concept that seemed to be kind of developing in the first few tracks is completely abandoned. Of course, Barely Alive does still manage to put together a pretty solid, diverse album, but it does so in a way that feels more like an expansion of We Are Barely Alive than this own singular project. So yeah, Odyssey did round out as a bit messy for my typical taste, but I would blame that on Barely Alive just trying to do too much on this album. I think if they would have focused less on trying to make it a full-on sci-fi and like a journey along with that too, I think it could have been a little bit of an easier listen. And the messiness obviously doesn't completely discredit Barely Alive on this album. That being said, I'm just going to go through this album track by track and get some quick thoughts out about each song. The intro/title track isn't one that I personally felt really positively toward. I feel that Jeffrey Summer sample is completely overused and I wasn't really excited to hear it in this song. Beyond that, honestly, the song kind of embodies everything I don't like about Barely Alive's current state. Goes for that very trendy RIDDIM sound, and like I mentioned earlier in this review, kind of abandons that personality that I felt like made Barely Alive's early releases such standouts. Know About Me though, the following track, I've actually come to like quite a bit. I don't think the Virus Syndicate feature is absolutely fantastic, but there are certainly some things I really enjoy about this track. It's very zany and ridiculous, which makes it out to be a pretty fun track. I especially enjoy that first drop where it's got those dissonant chords that almost make the song sound like it belongs in like an old horror flick. Deeper in Love was probably the song that I was looking forward to the most prior to this album's release, considering that Great Good Fine Okay featured on what is probably my all-time favorite Chainsmokers song. During my first few listens of this song though, I honestly felt a little bit underwhelmed, especially because that lead melody is just so repetitive throughout the song. Looking back at it now though, that repetition doesn't really take away all the things that make the song great, especially that killer vocal performance from Great Good Fine Okay. Would definitely call this one of my favorites on the album. Traversely though, I didn't think Bad Thing was that great at all. In fact, the one positive thing I'd really have to say about it was I liked how it kind of captured those old school ravey vibes and some of the chords and the build-up. Beside that, all this song really did was remind me how bad Split Breed has become and that they're somehow even worse than they were on their last album. They've really just lost any sense of uniqueness or flair that they had in their lyrics before. At this point, they might as well be labeled as like a Far East Movement knockoff. Xenomorph is another one that I'd say I didn't really feel super positively toward. I guess the one main good thing that I'd have to say about it is I really enjoy how the trap percussion kind of goes with the violins in the intro of the song, but the drop I just found to be really uninteresting. Bounce With Me I'd say is actually a pretty solid production, but there is one major thing holding it back for me, and that's that it sounds even more like a ripoff of Medicine's Territory than Skrillex's Humble remix does. Devil's Tower may very well be my favorite song on this album. For the most part, it's a bass house tune that works in these very deserty Middle Eastern music influences in a really cool way. But then that second drop hits and it's just... good lord. Probably one of the filthiest trap drops I've ever heard, and it sounds absolutely fantastic at 128. There are two collaborations with rapper I Am Sue found on the same track in the form of New Coupe and Ride Out. For me, I wasn't really that interested in New Coupe, and Ride Out is actually by far the standout of the two for me. Though I don't think the hook on Ride Out is absolutely fantastic. I think I Am Sue's flow on this song is much better, and the beat is much more unique on Barely Alive's part. I also quite enjoyed the lyrics on Ride Out, which I can't really say the same about New Coupe. The lyrics seemed a bit nonsensical to me. War of the Worlds, though it's more of an interlude than anything, I think is one of the best songs on the album. It's pretty dang immersive, and honestly it immerses me into what this album is trying to do more than any other song on the track list. And then it's got a really great synth solo that I just really enjoy every time I come through it. Buddy seems to be Barely Alive's attempt at doing like a Calvin Harris slide kind of song, and I really was not into it at all. The lyrics kind of made me feel like I was back in middle school or elementary school even. Wompum is the one track on the album that I'd say I really have a love-hate relationship with. I think some of the vocal samples on this song are really grossly out of place, especially the one from Welcome to Mayhem. There's a sample from Zomboy's Terror Squad, there's a sample from Binary off the last Barely Alive album, there's that Run the Trap sample in there too. I'd say more than anything though, the thing that makes me really like this song is kind of similar to Know About Me, where it's just kind of a zany, ridiculous RIDDIM song. I'm not really crazy about the first drop at all, but I think Barely Alive kind of does that on purpose in order to make the second and third drops a little bit more impactful and impressive. Shutdown is another song on the album that I honestly didn't really care about. There's some kind of wonky offbeat elements going on during the drop that I thought were pretty solid, but other than that, I don't think the song really brings that much to the table. Warrior featuring Discount Raga Twins is another one that I feel like is contender for best song on this album. It's one of the craziest, most off-the-wall drum and bass songs that I've heard this year, and that's really all I have to say about it. And the song Over, I'll admit I kind of hated during my first run through of this album, but I've come to appreciate it quite a bit more, to the point where it might even be one of my favorites now. It reminds me a lot of the song No Time, which was fittingly the closer of the We Are Barely Alive album, in the way that it's kind of a softer, more emotional driven garage track to start out with, but then it kind of flips interestingly into a bit of like Barely Alive future bass, which I guess on my first run through reminded me of Virtual Riot's Still Kids EP in like the worst way possible. That was definitely a major turnoff for me, but I don't know, there's something really amusing to me about those like dubstep bass lines that are going on during the background of the drop. And then the synth line, honestly, going into like the second half of the drop is really fantastic to me and made the song, honestly, for me. This song's fine. I mean, I don't think it's absolutely phenomenal, but it is interesting to say the least, and I think a cool way to close the album off. And yeah, I guess that's really all I have to say about Barely Alive's Odyssey. I think I really covered all the grounds, and maybe even more grounds than I wanted to. For Odyssey, I am personally feeling a strong 7 out of 10. If you guys haven't checked out this album for yourselves, as always, I have the Spotify link down in the description so you can go listen to it. And if you have listened to it already and have been enjoying it or not enjoying it or whatever, let me know down in the comments section below. As always, I'm Landon Remixes. I hope you guys enjoyed this review, and I'll catch you later. Peace.